You mentioned, Abdurrahman Khan there, and for, me being a Hazara, and for us, the source of our tragedy, in a sense, begins with him. I mean, what
Hmm.
was that source of destruction in the 1890s between the Abdurrahman and the Hazaras?
Oh, I mean, well, I think it's, I don't know how to describe it really. I mean, and I think the Australian government has actually recognised it as genocide, as officially,
Hmm.
um, and they've given Hazaras a special sort of niche in terms of immigration because of that. Um, I mean, it was certainly genocidal. You could argue, as some of my colleagues have done, as a well, it was justifiable in a sense because they needed to control the area and it was a revolt. But I mean, Abdurrahman Khan. I mean, as I point out, I mean if you go back into the 1880s, 1888, with the rebellion of the Sadr Khan up in Turkestan, we actually have the atrocities that were taking place. I mean, the British reports themselves, in which eyewitnesses report, people like Griesbach,
Hmm.
and the Vakil, the Munshi, the British Munshi, writing these reports, which are just like um, the guys are in sort of total trauma themselves with what they've seen, um, about what's going on and the executions and the barbarity that was taking place, and just like everybody who's, I mean, hundreds, we don't know how many people were killed, and we find the British themselves talking about in the reports which I published in my previous book on the ancient
Hmm.
supremacy. The reports there, the British are saying, they're using the word um, oh, I've forgotten the words. So they talk about it as uh, not so they don't use the word genocide because the word genocide is the word that is created later. They're talking about it in terms of serious atrocities, um, of and they're appalled, but they do nothing about it. Basically, they write a letter that Viceroy writes to the Emir and says, that's not really really a good thing that you're doing, and you should stop it. And but yeah, at the same time, you need to repress your enemies, deal justice. But they just say, well, at the end of the day, they couldn't do anything about it. Because what do you do? The only thing the British could have done was invaded again, and
Hmm.
had yet another war in Afghanistan, which they could come out with a bloody nose. Um, so you talk about it as a reign of terror, and so we have this in a sense almost like a precursor to what happens in Hazarajat. I mean, unfortunately, the reign of Abdurrahman Khan, was one, of huge atrocities against many people, and I think the Hazara wars were probably the worst because by this time, by the mid 1890s, Abdurrahman Khan was, if not quite insane, but he was certainly totally, he was at the point where he was in any other situation he would have been either displaced or he would have, wouldn't have been eligible to reign to rule because of his basically the way in which his illness had eating into his brain and into his whole psyche. But I mean, I think what happened to the Hazara communities. I mean, was appalling, and terrible. And and I know it resonates very strongly within the Hazara community to this day. In a sense, it's kind of like almost an identifying or thing. It's kind of like we share this
Hmm.
pain, this agony, regardless of which particular faction or whatever we come from. It wasn't. I don't know. Technically you could classify it as genocide. I mean, I can't find any account of anything going on in like across into the western side of Yakolang and that area. I don't even know whether it was mostly Bamiyan and Hajikak and sort of like
Ura's gone.
Uruzgan, but like Yakolang doesn't seem to come into that. I don't
Hmm.
know why, but I mean it's probably too remote. But yeah, I think it was an awful, thing, and it would be nice if somewhere along the line there was some sort of recognition of that by the state.
Mm.
Um, but I think it's how I think it comes back to how one defines oneself. Do you define oneself on that basis, or because of something different? For me, the comparison, I mean, as you know, I'm writing a book on the Afghan community, the Armenian community of Afghanistan. You know, if you look at the Armenian case, I mean, they suffered two genocides, one in the late 1800s and one during the First World War, at the hands of not really so much the Ottoman state, although the Ottoman state encouraged it, but at the hands of local Kurds, but also local militias, but also the Turkish army was involved. And I mean, it's recognized officially as a genocide by some countries anyway. And I mean, the accounts of that was just as harrowing probably as some of the ones that we read from the account of the Hazara Wars and the atrocities that were committed there. But the Armenians still own that. I mean, I went some years ago to commemoration of the Armenian genocide. It was held in Auckland. There was a number of Armenians there. So for them, it's part of their history. It's very much part of their identity, but they also have moved on in terms of we recognize this, we accept this, we would like that to be recognized internationally. I'm not sure whether the New Zealand government has done so or not, but we know that's part of our history, and it's a horrible part of our history. But we have moved on as well from that. We haven't just been defined just purely by that pain and by that suffering and by that, the terrible things that happened when our ancestors were massacred and left to starve, and I mean, it's horrible. And there's photographs about it, which we don't have from the Hazara Wars, but
Yeah.
we have photographic records of bodies being strewn by the road and burnt in churches and things. It was, and a lot of reports as well in the Anglican Church, in records in London, and American reporters. So we have a lot of documentation on it. Unfortunately, with the Hazara War, there's very, very little in that respect because it was too early. But yeah, I mean, I can understand how Hazaras feel in a sense. I mean, I've never had to go through that sort of thing. I've never had my family sort of,
And I suppose
fall
it's part
into
of the,
it.
because of the continued persecution, I suppose you cannot, the Armenians, for example, have had their own state, and they've had
Mm-hmm.
they've got a history where, they've got a semblance of, not a semblance, but they've had prosperity per,
Mm-hmm.
modern standards, a state, a history, a place in the world, but the Hazaras have not really had that.
I mean, I think that very much. I mean, again, it's my question is to what extent was the Hazara governed by
Mm,
Kabul? I actually think, reading the sources there, basically it was mostly self-governing by um, local tribal leaders or clan leaders. Um, there are all sorts of different terms being used in different parts of the Hazara Jal for people who are power brokers, whether those are indigenous names or whether they're ones that have been borrowed or imposed. But yeah, I mean, it comes back to what I was saying. Historically, these areas were in fact self-governing. So the way it worked, for example, I mean, in up until probably until the reign of Dost Khan, is that you had so for example, in my manner, which I've spent a lot of time writing about in the ancient supremacy, so there was an indigenous dynasty there of Uzbeks, and that dynasty goes back to the time when Bukhara was the sovereign power
mm,
in beyond when the area of Balkh from the Murghab to Badakhshan was not part of the Afghan polity, but was actually under the authority of the Khans of Bukhara. So this dynasty survived right the way down to about the 1890s when they were finally deposed. And the last emir was executed, apparently. And that was the same, like Shibaghan, Bukhara, Shibaghan, Maimuna, Saripul, and Khoy, they were known as the Shah Wilayat. Qunduz had its own Uzbek ruler. So what the emir in Kabul did was that they accepted that person as the ruler, and they were responsible for the government of that particular area. In return, they had to pay tribute, and occasionally, and often provide soldiers as well. So, for example, we find Dost Muhammad Khan building this relationship with Emir Wali in Qunduz, in Khum, as an ally. And in fact, when Wazir Akbar Khan comes back from the northern Afghanistan during the first Afghan war and comes into Kabul in the winter of 1842, and then starts attacking the British forces. The army that he brought with him were actually Uzbeks. They were not Pashtuns, they were not Tajik, they were all Uzbeks. They were militia that was provided by the Mir Wali from who they were in alliance with from Tashkent, from Khulm. Which is not hardly mentioned in the sources. You know, the Uzbek actually take part in the defeat of the British army of the Indus. So this is the way it always worked in the Muslim world in this particular era. A local lord, and also in the medieval period in Europe, a local lord submitted and recognized the overall supremacy of, the emir or the shah, but he was allowed to rule his area indigenously, collect the taxes, but provided he kept paying taxes, provided levies, and did a few, protected the frontier or the area from there, he was left to his own devices. It was when we find towards the end of after the first Afghan war, we find Dost Muhammad Khan changing all that, putting his sons and other Mohammedites into governorships all around the country. And obviously starting in the invasion of Balkh in 1849, which resulted in the subjugation of the region, the removal of some of the local rulers. And so you have this gradual development into this sort of centralized state. The belief was that somehow or other, we have the right to appoint the Hakim to Maimuna, who may be from another ethnic group, but who has actually no connection with that community whatsoever. So he's seen as a begona, as an alien. And he doesn't understand the local language. So we have these cases, for example, with the Afghanization of the 1880s and 1890s, of Pashtun officials going in there, and they can't actually speak the local language, the Uzbek or Turkmani, so they have to use interpreters. I mean, it's like a foreign occupation. So the way in which the government functioned, probably up until around about the mid-1900s, or 19th century, it was very, very different to the way in which the government evolved during the 20th century, which became very, very centralized. And of course, we have this autocracy being evolved, and the idea of, and then I think it was reinforced by the communist occupation, where, and there's still this myth or this idea within central government that somehow or other, the local authority, local rulers, or local power brokers don't really have to really be controlled by people sent from Kabul, rather than some sort of alignment going on with them. So you appoint your mates to that position. So I mean, for example, I can remember in 2004 in Puli Khumri, the new governor had arrived. And he was an old apparatchik from the King's days. He was the mate of, uh, he'd actually lived in America for donkey's years. And he came back and he expected the kind of taarruf that he would have expected when he was, previously
Kind
governor
of
of Herat.
respect and reverence and
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and the we call it forelock pulling, bally side, bally side, bally side.
yeah, Valley side.
Um,
Yes, Minister.
um, and the local people was like, who the hell is this man? We don't know him. He doesn't know us. You know, there's total disassociation between the person appointed as governor and the actual population. And they change so frequently that, you're never quite sure, tomorrow if you're going to have another guy arriving, you've just worked out some sort of modus vivendi with this guy, you've got to know him, you've patronized him, you've done all the right things to make sure that
Yeah.
he's on your side, and then he's just reappointed or he's sacked or he's killed, and then somebody else comes in and you have to go this whole thing all over again.
Yeah.
And with all the kind of expense that involves as well, whether it's in Rishwat or whether it's in, Memoni or whatever,
Yeah.
And so the way in which Afghanistan is governed is not the way it was, say, 100, 200 years ago. It was very, very different. And I think in some ways it's been for the worse rather than for the better.
You mentioned the communists there. I mean, we had Thomas Barfield in one of the previous episodes, and for listeners and those who watch on YouTube, please do go and have a look at that as well. And he compared the Taliban to the communists, the PDPA. Who would you compare the Taliban to?
Oh, I think comparing it to the PDPA is a little bit I don't know,
In terms
stretching
of
it a bit, I
ideological
think.
rigidity, I suppose.
Well, I mean, the communists were well educated, you know, um, people, many of them came from university backgrounds and so on. I mean, a lot of the Taliban don't have that background. They come out of a madrasa. I think they're a very different, very, very different movement. They certainly have a very, very different ideology. Um, you may argue that in terms of some of their policies, um, it's very similar. But I don't know because I mean, I was in Afghanistan during the first Taliban government, which was, I think, it was quite an interesting experience. It was quite different to the outside perceptions, where the emphasis wasn't so much so on the gender thing, on the gender issue and the gender war. Um, I I found things very, very different. I mean, being a bloke, of course, I didn't have much to do with that side of things, but
Yeah.
we were trying to set up a Dutch agency that wanted to do some sort of work, to deal with the issues of poverty and rehabilitation of irrigation systems in a place called Khaki Jabbar, which is right down one of the most poor areas of Kabul, which is a hillside area, the Jabal Khail. So we had a very different experience with the Taliban. So I'm I think we just have to see the Taliban as the Taliban rather than try to say compare to them. There seems to be, and I don't know, there seems to be some of the old Khod people maybe have sort of aligned themselves with the Taliban. Certainly it seems their intelligence service is working pretty effectively. But they're a very different movement. They're very, very different people. I mean, obviously, many of them come out of a refugee environment in the Northwest Frontier. In terms of what we might call modern style education, they, by and large, don't have that. Although some of them seem to be more articulate than the previous government. So I think we have to get away from these kind of comparisons. The fact that they tend to be autocratic is nothing new to Afghanistan. Afghanistan
Yeah, yeah,
government. We've just been talking about Abdul Rahman Khan.
yeah.
You know, so again, it's the model that they're following. You know, that I question: is this the right model?
But is it
Having
sustainable?
Khadar Medona.
God only knows.
God knows.
Thank you so much. I mean, this
Um,
this 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 book, it is such a hefty book, packed with information. I mean,
we're
look,
going to do a Ladybird version of it. Do you know that? You know the
no,
Ladybird books?
yeah, it is. Let me have a look. It's
600 and something pages.
697 pages full of incredible history and story of Afghanistan, which is, the most detailed history of Afghanistan I've read. And
Oh,
I
that's
mean,
nice to know.
what kind of an undertaking was this? I mean, you know, it's did it make you a lot of money though?
Yeah, right.
Well, it's really expensive on Amazon, but it's it's
It-
it's worth it. I mean, it's such a
I,
wonderful book.
okay. When people ask me about, about my royalties, I just laugh. I say, buy my book. Every book that you buy, it's another flat white for me. Flat white, you know what a flat white is?
Yeah,
Coffee.
coffee. Yes.
Okay, so coffee, flat whites are a very New Zealand Australian thing. Flat whites. You go
Ah,
to England and you ask them for a flat white, and they look at you and they have no idea what you're talking about. Or even if they do, I say I want a large flat white. No, we don't do large flat whites. I said, what do you mean you don't do large flat whites? You do large lattes. You do large cappuccino. It's all written up there on the board.
yeah.
And why can you not do a large flat white?
Mm.
And I said, because a double flat white involves 2 shots of coffee. I said,
Ah.
and what's that got to do with it? I can go across to my local store 150 meters away and I can get a large flat white. Nobody bothers.
I
So
should
I
do a
say,
trip
every
to.
time you buy a copy of my book, that's mine. That's my next flat white.
You're
That's the
definitely
amount of
worth more
royalty.
than that. You definitely. I mean, you worth. I suppose. Uh, how could I put it? Teapots full of green tea, and one after the other, and with a lot of watermelon and kharbuza and everything.
Horbally Pala.
Oh yes, holy.
Oshak, Horbally, and Bologna Bon John, please.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Now you want me to yeah, you got me. So what is your favorite? I say you are teetotal. Are you still teetotal?
No, no, no. I'm sadly not. Well, no, no, no longer. But I was brought up teetotal.
So okay,
Except that,
so
well,
what is
my
your
father
favorite?
liked his whiskey and a smoke before he went to bed, and my mother had a secret little bottle of sherry which she kept away, and every so often she'd
And what about you? What do
go
you
in and
have on your bedside table?
an alarm clock,
No, I mean in
a
terms of
radio.
beverages. Yeah. So what is
Right.
what is your kick?
I don't have kicks. I just have rather nice fine single malt whiskies.
Oh, that's my favorite as well. Now, when you have that and sitting
Bubba,
around with your friends,
Afakunim, Afakunim. I'm sorry to
yeah,
my
yeah.
Afghan friends,
No, no, no. I
but
mean,
I.
um, when you
So
sit
just
around
come
with,
in. Can I just come back to the royalties? And if my publisher is listening, Michael, thank you so much for letting me publish this book and for accepting the fact that it was twice as long as you actually thought it was going to be.
I'm so
Um,
grateful that he's
so,
done
so
that, and a lot of people and the world is actually better off with understanding
oh,
Afghanistan a bit better. And I do love the book. I have it on my bookshelf. It's a great reference.
great.
But when you have your single malt and reminiscing about Afghanistan, what really comes to your mind when you want to reminisce, bring the sweet stuff, to make them laugh, to giggle about Afghanistan? What's that, top-notch story that you share with them? Let's end it with a kind of a cheery note.
Gosh,
Something
this
maybe
is
not
just
chance involved or something like,
no,
or
no.
whether you may, it's up to you.
I wouldn't know really where I'd start. I've got so many stories. And my mind's gone completely blank. because I didn't know you were going to ask me that
Pour, pour,
question.
pour that single malt. Pour that single malt.
Oh, no, it's only, you're not allowed to have it before 12 o'clock. It's only 10 o'clock here in
Oh
New
yeah,
Zealand.
yeah. I've lost track of my time. You're
I can
oh,
remember. I'll come back to one anecdote. Warwick Ball, my colleague and friend, who I spent some time with when I was in Britain recently, and if Warwick's listening to this, he probably won't be because he doesn't engage with social media. But he he and I we told this story about we met this guy who's a Peace Corps worker back in the 1970s, and he was talking about Afghanistan, and he was describing Afghanistan as the poor man's moon. And I think if I ever write my memoirs, which, I'm 75 this year, I probably won't get around to it.
no, you should. I mean,
I would
well,
I
I
would
wish
call
you
it the
did.
poor man's moon, I think.
Yes, full of all those stories.
Yeah, yeah. And it's kind of like Star Trek, really. In a sense, you kind of go into this place which we really didn't know very much about when I was, an undergraduate in 1970. It was quite an adventure, really. I think my mother thought I was, never going to come back, and I was going to, you know, be murdered or something like that. But it is a journey of exploration always with Afghanistan. Um, and you meet so many amazing people, and you hear all sorts of amazing stories. And the thing you talk about anecdotes. The one thing that struck me was the Afghan sense of humor. I mean, they're wicked. The sense of humor. I mean, they have all these stories about people. Some of them are not. They're not malicious, but um, it's amazing. I mean, you have the kind of Mullah Nasruddin sort of culture as well, which I love. Mullah Nasruddin, I think he's fantastic. And but also lots of anecdotes about sort of what people have done and how they performed. Gossip is fantastic, and it's great. You sit in a tea house or in a mehmonkhana somewhere out in some remote place in Gurziwan or in Karokh or something like that, and it's the anecdotes that you hear, and in a sense, kind of the book kind of comes out of that kind of culture of what one has learned and listened to and hearing different ways of looking at Afghan history from the sort of like from the bottom up rather than from the top down.
Hmm.
Um, I can't think of any particular thing that that comes to mind. Oh, I can tell you about falling off the horse in Maimana.
You didn't do that as you
Okay, I'll
do.
tell you a horse story. Can I tell you two
Okay.
horse
Yeah,
stories?
yeah, 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 yeah. Tell me the whole
Okay.
story.
Okay, so as you all know, Buzkashi is the great thing of northern Afghanistan.
Hmm.
And if you go to the Maimana area, they all think that they're the best. And Ghaziwan particularly, they think they're the greatest Buzkashi players. So I was in Ghaziwan in Darai Shah, in a place called Darai Shah, back in 1977. And I was basically the first Khariji that they'd actually met. They no, they met them sometimes in Maimana, but it was a really, really remote area. Nobody really ever went there. In fact, when I went back again in 1996 to document the Roubion wall painting, I asked them, "Has any other Horiji come here since I was here in the 1970s?" And they said, "Oh, when the Russians were here, we had one group of Tajik soldiers who came and landed in a helicopter. They came out and they asked lots of questions because they could speak Farsi, and they got back in the helicopter and went away, and that was it." So anyway, so they said to me, "Oh, you're a Maimon. You're our Maimon. We'll put on
You're
a
a guest.
Buzkashi.
You're a guest.
You're a guest." Yeah. So they staged a Buzkashi thing for me. That was amazing. Just like almost overnight, suddenly they had these Buzkashi guys, and so being the guest, they said, "Oh, would you like to ride one of the horses?" And now I have ridden like ponies and things like in the in England. And I looked at this fearsome beast and I said, oh, no. But I mean, you know what it's like. Or they insist you must do
Yeah,
this.
yeah,
You've
yeah,
got to
yeah.
do this. You must. And you think, oh well, God, I've got to do this. And afterwards, you suddenly realize when you get more experience, this was just like this was the main entertainment of the day, not the buskashi, but the horigi on a buskashi horse falling
Falling.
off. So I got on this buskashi horse. God, it was fearsome, and the thing went hell for leather.
Hmm.
And because I was doing the usual things, pulling on the reins, and they kept saying, "Pull the reins, pull the reins." I couldn't get this thing to stop. I actually managed not to fall off the horse, and I actually managed to get it stopped. And I got off, but I was like this all the time. And so that was quite fun. On the other, I suppose the other anecdote was in Maiman as well, was they asked me to referee a football match. Um, Now I'm a rugby player, cricket and rugby. I didn't know how to play football until I was 11 years old. Um, this was in Maiman in the Chaman.
Yes,
Those of
yeah.
you, if you're listening in, know anywhere about Maiman, there's a big, well, it was, whether it's still there or not, there was a big Chaman there. And
Chamar, I mean, for English speaking
just a
listeners,
green field in
greenery.
the
Yeah.
middle of, yeah, it's like a park, but it was used for all sorts of things. So, yeah. So again, absolutely insisting, you've got to do this, you've got to do this, you've got to do this. And I kept saying, look, I don't know one side from the other because nobody's wearing any uniform. How do I know? If somebody scores a goal, if it's an own goal or not an own goal, and my durry was not that great in those days, and so they gave me this whistle, and I kept saying, well, look, why don't you get like all the ones on one side just like not wear a turban or or something else. Somehow some sort of distinction, so I know you know so anyway, the story was that I refereed this match for about 5 minutes, and I gave a goal away to somebody who I gave a penalty to somebody who actually I was the wrong side anyway, so I gave it was complete chaos. But I think I kind of like passed into local legend as this dear one of Horigi, this mad,
They want
crazy
to just mad foreigner.
foreigner. But in a sense, they're never going to forget me, and I've been told by people I know from Closely One who say, "Oh, you're still remembered,"
Oh,
and
that's
I think
great.
reasonably affectionately because
That's great.
you
I
know,
mean,
but partly because I'm the eccentric foreigner.
on that cheerier note, Dr. Jonathan L. Lee, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've really enjoyed our discussion, as
Thank
I
you.
did our discussion and meeting in Oxford. Let's do it again sometimes, maybe
Yeah.
back here or in your end
Can,
of the wood. End
can
of
I
the
do a
woods,
quick
neck
promo?
of the wood.
Neck of the woods. Can I do a
Yes.
quick promo?
Yes.
So, The Ancient Supremacy, which is my earlier book, is now translated into Dari, and it should be available. So is the book on Afghanistan from 1260. However, unfortunately, the stock has been confiscated by the Taliban and it's been banned, which is sad.
So
But
where do we find it outside Afghanistan?
I think they're going to reprint it in Iran. The Ancient Supremacy, I think, has been printed in Germany or somewhere like that. Uh, um, I'm waiting to hear from the publishers about. I'm hoping to get a copy of it actually myself. But yeah, it's definitely both been translated. They should be able to find it somehow or other, some way through the Afghan network. I think it was Kabul Books who did uh, the Afghanistan history. I'm not quite sure who the people who did the ancient supremacy were, but it's in Dari now.
That's
Should be.
wonderful, and I'll have a look and
Mm.
definitely
And
give it a plug. An absolute
thank you
pleasure.
for.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I hope. And yes, we'll chat again soon sometime.
Great.
Keep in
Thank
touch.
you. Have a good one.
Khadafis.
Khudafis. Khudafis.